Hello, trumpet friends. Today we're going to talk about rhythms. When you ask most musicians what rhythms are, it's one of those questions that throws them for a loop. Just like asking someone on the street what is love, or you know what I mean? Those kind of terms are very difficult to define, right? It sounds very simple. What is a rhythm? Well, some people will say, for example, a rhythm is the beat. Well, no. The rhythm and the beat are two different things. So what is rhythm? Is rhythm, now some people will say, uh, the rhythm is how long the notes are. And that's getting a little closer. Uh, some people will say how many beats the notes get. That's starting to get closer, right? Uh, the way I like to look at rhythm, I define rhythm as something that is superimposed over the top of the meter. And if we're talking in jazz language or pop music language, the groove, rhythms are superimposed over the groove, over the meter. In my trumpet world, groove and meter are the same thing. It just depends on who we're talking to, right? Um, so to me, those two terms are interchangeable. The rhythm is so dependent on the meter that if you take the meter away, there is no rhythm. Let that sink in for a little bit. Without meter, there is no rhythm. So if you had written on a piece of music a quarter note, an eighth note, and a 16th note, it means absolutely nothing without a meter. Now, we say that the meter is the time signature, right? That's only half true. The meter is supposed to be represented by the time signature, and the way I like to compose music, I like to use the written meter, the written time signature to represent the meter. Not everybody does that. Not everybody knows to do that. There are some people who, and this is a crazy example, but I've seen pieces that were in 4/4 written in 3/4. The meter was clearly in 4/4 if you listen to the music, but they wrote it over a 3/4. And you know what? The only reason to have that, I know I'm on a tangent, but the only reason to have that kind of music is for academic reasons. It's something that will help you learn. But if you're in the business of making music, not necessarily teaching music or learning music, if you're in the business of creating music, you don't do something like that. The meter is supposed to match the time signature. Anyway, getting back to what a rhythm is. A rhythm is when you uh, partition the different beats of the meter to different notes. Let's say that again. A rhythm, or rhythms, plural, are when you partition different um, parts of the meter to different notes. Okay? So when you say that a whole note is 4 beats long, that's not necessarily correct. Okay? A whole note could start on, you can have a four-note note starting on the third beat. You would have to write it as two half notes. Is that the same? Is a half note tied to a half note the same thing as a whole note? If it's on measure beat three half note tied to a beat one of the next measure half note, is that the same thing as a whole note that starts on beat one? I'm here to tell you that it's not the same thing. It has the same number of beats, but it happens in a different place in the meter. So it is performed differently. Okay? So in order to make this point more clearly, we're going to look at a series of graphs here. Okay? I'm calling these beat graphs. This first one is just a metronome. Same level of beat, same intensity of beat all the way through. The vertical lines here represent the beat. The horizontal line represents time. Now, let's look at a classical 2/4 measure. In classical music, the 2/4 measure is supposed to have, and let me clarify, what we're talking about here is what's taught, not necessarily what's done. Not that this isn't done. I'm not saying this is not the case. But I don't wanna be having to argue with people later that say, well, Mr. Lewis, that isn't necessarily how it works. Well, I'm talking about how it's taught, and yes, people do teach this, okay? Strong beat for beat one, weak beat for beat two. And what you see in the graph here is two complete measures, and then one half of a measure at the end of the timeline, okay? Now, if we compare that to a 4/4 measure, and remember, we're talking about what's taught. 4/4 has a strong beat, a weak beat, a medium beat, and then another weak beat. Now, why does that matter? Remember when we were talking about a whole note that starts on the third beat? That third beat is weaker than the first beat. So it should not be played the same as a whole note that's on a strong beat. Okay? And let's go back to the 2/4 measure. Take a look at the 2/4 measure. In my opinion, a 4-beat note. Oh, let's do a 4-beat pattern. Let's say we have 4 quarter notes on the first beat, the second beat, and then the first of the next measure and the second of the next measure. That's going to be performed, those 4 notes are going to be performed differently in 2/4. Now let's look at the 4/4 again, than they would over the 4/4. You see that? It's the same. People will say, well, Mr. Lewis, it's the same rhythm. It's not the same rhythm. Because rhythm includes, in my opinion, if you go by my definition, right? A rhythm is the way that the notes are partitioned over the meter. Okay? If you go with my definition of what rhythm is, then 4 quarter notes in 4/4 are going to be performed rhythmically different. Because the emphasis on which note you play is part of the rhythm. Where you put the strong beat and the weak beat is part of the rhythm. Okay? So you compare 2/4 to 4/4, 2/4 is going to be strong quarter note, weak quarter note, strong quarter note, weak quarter note. Now we're talking subtleties here. When I say strong, weak, we're not talking about overly exaggerated stuff. Okay? Now, the 4/4 quarter notes would be strong, weak, medium, weak. And you know what? We can make this even more complicated when we look at the upbeats. Let's take a look at jazz stuff now. We're taught that in jazz, the beats 2 and 4 are the strong beats. That's why people will count off 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? If you're not new to jazz, you already know about this. Okay? So this graph that I'm showing you here is another 4/4 measure, but depicted the way we teach classical jazz music, right? Now let's look at the next one. Some people will tell you that swing is done in triplets. I actually disagree with that. Maybe there are some Ricky Tick style swing, maybe if you're playing with Guy Lombardo or something like that, maybe it is a triplet feel. What we call modern jazz, which is most of what's being taught in the schools, it's not a triplet. It's closer to even. So we're going to look at this graph. Look at this, and it looks almost the same. But instead of, now, I should clarify here that it's just as preposterous for me to do this 3/5, 2/5 thing, but we're going to talk about that in a second. But at least 3/5, 2/5 is closer to reality in swing. And we'll come back to that, like I said. Now, if you play an 8th note rhythm, let's say you're going to do a whole measure of 8th notes. Let's say you have an 8th note run. And you're going to use the 2/3, 1/3 division. And someone else is going to use a 3/5, 2/5 division. Tell me that's the same rhythm. It'll look the same on the paper. It's not the same rhythm. So what's happening here? Now, whether you think that my charts were accurate for the styles that I'm talking about does not matter. What matters here is that different styles of music, different genres, have different emphases on different beats. Strong beats, weak beats, and a whole myriad of in-between emphases, okay? And then also what happens between the beat can be vastly different from one genre to another. If we look at my definition of what a rhythm is, the groove or the meter that you're playing in dictates not only the strong and weak emphases, but also where exactly is the upbeat or the triplet or any of that other stuff going to sit. I've had so many stories from my career that demonstrate what I'm talking about here with the connection of the rhythm to the meter. One of the earliest ones, back when I was at UTEP, the University of Texas at El Paso, UTEP was close enough to the border crossing that a lot of times we would park our cars, walk across the border, have lunch over there, and then go back to school. And, they had street musicians over there, and I remember distinctly that there was a group that came up, it was I think a bass. It was interesting because the bass had only 3 strings in it, and I was watching what this guy was doing. And if I'm not mistaken, the middle string was the tonic. The the um the string on the left was the subdominant, and the string on the right was the dominant. Very, very interesting. Um, but yeah, it was a bass and a guitar and somebody singing or something like that. Or maybe they had different combinations like that. So I think bass guitar and saxophone one time. But I noticed that when they were playing in 3/4, where they put the second beat was always anticipated just a little bit. And it didn't feel uncomfortable. And in fact, if you listen to it long enough, that almost sounded like the way it should be. That is what I mean when I'm talking about different genres or different styles having their own meter, their own groove. Those kind of different, you could call them idiosyncrasies, but to them that's not an idiosyncrasy. It's only that way to us because we've never heard that before. Okay? To them that is. And by the way, while I'm at it, this thing that I'm saying about meter and groove, this is yet one more demonstration of exactly why you cannot, and I've said this several times in some other videos, you cannot separate the music from the people or the music from the culture. How are you supposed to internalize a particular groove or a particular meter as an outsider? If you quarantine the music from the people, I've been using that word a lot lately. If you quarantine the music from the people and try to study it academically, you can't internalize this meter. Because you know what? These charts that I was showing you earlier, that's actually preposterous. All of the different meters that are specific to those different genres, you don't measure it out like that. You don't, like for jazz, you don't measure 3/5, 2/5. That's preposterous. It's a feel thing. Same thing with this trio thing, this waltz thing that I heard when I was in Juarez, that I'm talking about now, right? You don't calculate exactly how much sooner the anticipation is on that second beat. That's not how that works. You submerge yourself, you envelop yourself in that culture, and that's how you pick up the meter or the groove of that music. Okay? So all the stuff, a lot of what I'm talking about here is interconnected like that. A lot of it is interconnected. So, when I talk here, what am I saying right now? I'm saying that the rhythms that you play are connected to the culture of the music you're playing. So what I'm saying is 3/8 notes in salsa are not the same as 3/8 notes in classical, or the same as 3/8 notes in jazz, or the same as 3/8 notes in funk. It's not the same. If you don't have a feel for the meter or the groove, you will play the music wrong. No matter, this is the funny part, right? No matter how right you think you're doing it, because You know, you made the eighth note exactly an eighth note and the half note exactly a half note. You're only thinking one-dimensionally. The rhythms include emphasis. The rhythms include subdivisions. And those subdivisions aren't exact. Those subdivisions are felt. The emphasis is not exact. The emphasis is felt. And there's no way to acquire that feeling without being part of that culture. Okay? Let me tell you another story. This one's from later, about 10, 15 years later. I remember working with a student, and the rhythm that the student was playing was wrong. And I told the student that the rhythm was wrong. And the student argued with me, told me no, I was wrong, because all of the notes that he was playing were exactly lined up in terms of proportion, thinking one-dimensionally. Now, I knew listening to it that the rhythm was wrong. But when we broke it down into each proportion, right? Because that's how most people think about rhythms. Just in that one dimension, half note is twice as long as a quarter note and all that stuff, right? In terms of ratio. But I could tell that the rhythm was wrong. And this is one of my aha moments, right? This is when I had an epiphany about all this. It was because he was placing accents in ways that were convenient for him. You know, the line he was playing had some intervals, and he was clobbering the notes that would make it easier for him to hit the interval. And that was giving the person on the outside the perception. The person listening from the outside, it gives them the perception that the rhythm is wrong, even though the proportions are exactly correct. You know, Sam Trimble, my teacher in El Paso, Sam Trimble used to tell me that we should strive to play a piece of music so accurately that someone in the audience with a good ear could transcribe, someone who'd never seen the music before, never heard the music before, could listen to what we were doing and transcribe exactly what was on the page from the audience. I think that's a wonderful way to put it. And one of the things that we do to communicate musically is to create within ourselves that groove that I'm talking about. I hope that's starting to sink in. So now, I hope I've established that the actual rhythms that you play, it's not good enough to get the proportions right. You have to get the feel correct. And you know what? Here's another example. There's a lot of hemiola in jazz. One of my friend's favorites is to do a four-note pattern with an eighth-note rest, right? 4 eighth notes and an eighth-note rest so that it comes out as a 5 pattern. And they'll go boo ba doo bap boo dee boo dee ba ba doo bap boo dee boo dee ba ba doo bap boo dee boo dee, right? You know, on different notes, but I'm giving you the rhythm here. Do you know that the first one is different from the second one because it's displaced? And if you're going over 4/4, it's displaced not only in terms of the upbeats, but also displaced in terms of strong beats and weak beats. So even though it's the same 5 eighth note pattern, one of them being a rest, even though it's the same pattern each time, it's performed differently each time because of the influence of the meter, the groove, while we're playing. So what does that mean for us in terms of how are we going to learn the rhythms? The first thing you have to do for any rhythmic work that you do is listen. You need to spend time listening to the music that you're trying to learn. And that can work on the macro level or the micro level. In fact, do both. Listen specifically to the music that if there's recordings of the music you're trying to learn, listen to that. Some people think that's cheating. It's not cheating. Okay? That's not cheating. That's not, some people will say that's you're spoon feeding the students. That's not spoon feeding. You can't learn the music right without hearing without hearing the meter. Listening is more, I've said this many times, it's one of my isms. Some people say that I have Eddie-isms, right? One of my Eddie-isms is that I say all the time, listening is more important than practicing. And this meter stuff, the rhythms and how they're connected to the meter are a big, big, big part of that. And I would go as far as to say that, okay, so we're talking about the specific listening. Then we have on the macro level, listening to music in that style, right? And this is where I was going to say, I would go as far as to say that the more live you can get, the more live your listening is, the more beneficial it is. Okay? The more live, so, and in fact, the closer you can get to the individual. So the best listening you can do is on a gig with somebody, sitting right there next to you. That's how it worked for me, and I'm sure that's how it works for almost everybody else. For example, I played in the Ed Gerlach band for almost 20 years. Started off as a sub, and then I was like his first call, on different chairs. I've played all three of the chairs. But it's like dance band, swing, society stuff, right? Not quite Gar Lombardo style. A little bit more hip than that, okay? Great band, by the way, with great players. And my concept of that style of music, the meter, the groove of that kind of music, the feel, comes from my time on that band. Now, I had some of that before that, but yeah, once I started playing a lot with Ed Gerlach, it really started to soak in. Now, I also had, for that particular genre, my dad listened to all that stuff when I was growing up. So I had already culturally been sort of acclimated. But then when I got into the Gerlach band, that's when it rubbed it all the way into my subconscious. Okay? And the same thing, I could sell the same exact story with the salsa stuff. I played salsa I started my first salsa gig was in the 1990, and I didn't really stop until about 22 years later. I started turning down those gigs. I saw one of the guys a couple weeks ago, and he was talking to his friend in Spanish. He said, yeah, he doesn't like us anymore. And he's joking, right? I miss those guys. I miss them badly. Now talk about a different kind of meter. We write salsa music in cut time or 4/4, but that's not the meter. The meter in salsa is the clave. And if you don't know the clave, you can't play salsa. I'm sorry. That's why people who don't know the clave, they say, come on, man, just tell me where one is. They don't hear one because that's not how the music works. But yes, I was submerged in that music. I know I'm on a tangent again, but we're talking about how being right next to somebody is the best listening you can do. That's why we're talking about that. I'm not trying to brag or anything. But me learning the intricate rhythms of the salsa music, what makes salsa music so different is that emphasis that we're talking about is not based on the traditional strong beat, weak beat of classical music or even jazz. It's based on the clave. So if you're in 3/2 clave, your second strong beat is the upbeat of 2. That's your second strong beat, the upbeat of 2. Okay? And that's what throws so many people off. A lot of people think that the third beat in that first 3 pattern, or so they think that's 1, or they think that part is 1. On the second note of the 2 pattern, they think that's 1. Okay? How do you get to stop playing those rhythms wrong? You spend time, and like I said, the listening. So we're talking about listening right now. The listening that I did sitting right next to somebody else playing that music that knew what they were doing. And that's what I mean by cultural. I don't mean when I say if you, to submerge yourself in that culture. I'm not saying that now if they smoke pot, you gotta smoke pot, or if they drink, you gotta drink. That's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm not me myself. I'm not a very sociable person, and yet I was part of that culture through the rehearsals that we did, through the performances that we did. Um, but I didn't feel like I had to, um, you know, do things. So I guess, I think maybe I should have clarified that all along when I talk about the culture. You know, I don't mean that we should do stuff that goes against our ethics or whatever. Because, the salsa culture is very much connected to the nightlife, I guess you could call it that. Right? And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, working with these guys in that context, in the musical context. Okay? You don't have to be, um, you know, that said, I think eating the food and trying to speak the language and all that stuff, I think that helps a whole bunch. I just don't think we have to feel compelled to do things that we don't think are right, just so we can do better at the music. That's not at all what I'm saying. Okay? So yes, we're going back to the subject. That was a long tangent. Um, the listening is paramount. The listening is paramount. You cannot you can't even think about getting the rhythms right if you haven't internalized the groove, the meter, the feel of that music. You know what happened? Here's another one. Here is another example from my career. I played with the Guy Lombardo band one time. This was I had just started getting like really, really good at sight reading. I used to brag about my sight reading of salsa music, right? And people say, oh, salsa is the hardest stuff it's not actually true. It's the people who say salsa is the hardest stuff to sight read, it's because they have never been in that culture. They never got the meter going. They don't understand clave. Okay? But I forgot what I was gonna say. Oh yeah, the Guy Lombardo gig. I bombed it. And this was one of my sight reading. Now my sight reading is actually better now, but at that time my sight reading, people were calling me all over the place, wanted me for my sight reading. I never thought I was a good player, but in terms of sight reading, but people were hiring me for that. I got to the Guy Lombardo band, and I'm putting notes in the wrong place. I've got this completely wrong feel, and they didn't want me back again, and I don't blame them because it was completely off. The rhythms were easier than what I usually do. Now, what happened? I made myself go and listen to a bunch of Guy Lombardo stuff and that kind of stuff. So the next time I had a gig in that style, I nailed it. Do I like to listen to Guy Lombardo music? I didn't back then. I like it a lot more now. That's one of the things about culture, right? You submerge yourself in that culture and you start liking stuff that you didn't think you would like. So, anyway, that's another story from my past that demonstrates what I'm talking about. I was so good at sight reading salsa music that they would give us charts that were written wrong and I would still play it right. So, that's how I used to brag about it. So yes, so that's the first thing. If you're trying to learn to play rhythms better, you got to be doing the listening and you need to be submerged. Um, I have a student right now that's doing the cultural thing perfectly because she's getting out there and she's playing with this group and she's playing with that group. She's getting out and getting hands-on experience. She's not trying to approach this stuff academically, sitting in a cubicle, okay? She's out doing it. And you know what? It makes so much difference in the player. And I have another student that I'm thinking of. I taught him for years, and so this was his first year. I taught him as a beginner, right? Taught him for years. He didn't think he was ready to perform, but this year he gets into a jazz band. He plays in a jazz band for a whole season. You should see the progress that this guy has made. Sorry about the phone. The progress this guy has made because he's now in that culture. It makes all the difference. If you try to take it anyway, I've already said sometimes I get on these rants and it's like a broken record. So that's the first step for learning rhythms is to make sure that you hear the rhythms. And you know what? I think that's 75% of it. That's 75% of learning rhythms is listening. The other part of it is the counting. Now, counting is more remedial. I don't think we have to count out rhythms as we get better. But if you are struggling with rhythms and you've never learned to count before, I think it's absolutely necessary. Why do I say that? Because when you count, now you know what just popped into my head? You know that there are certain Latin percussionists, I shouldn't say Latin, there's percussionists all over the world that have counting systems, even for the smallest notes. So I said that it was remedial. What I mean is what the stuff that we teach in band, the one-eander, two-eander stuff, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's very remedial rhythmic stuff. When I say something is remedial, that doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It's actually very important. Everyone should do it. And what I was about to say was that when you learn a counting system, you're learning how to attach the rhythms to the meter. When you say 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, you're taking that rhythmic pattern and overlaying it over the meter. And that's extremely important. I know this is becoming a long video, but this is, I feel like this is stuff that I've never heard anyone say before, and I feel like it's got to be said. This is what I teach my students. Rhythms are not arbitrary ratios. Because if you get the emphasis or the subdivisions wrong, if you get the feel wrong, you could play the rhythm exactly right and it's still wrong. Okay? So that's the next thing I would say is get some counting going. If you're not someone who's already counted, then you do that. Now, the next thing I would say is that it is possible to break rhythms down to talking about metronome stuff. Break the rhythms down to the slowest, isolate a certain rhythm, and then use the metronome. I had to do the metronome video first, and it's not published yet. I'm thinking about publishing the two of these videos together, so because they go together. The metronome video and this video, the two of them go together. And if we take a rhythm, let's say you have a really weird rhythm that's only 2 beats long in a 4/4 measure. I keep hitting the mic stand. If you take that and take it to half tempo and just work your way through that, those subdivisions, all the ratios of the rhythms in that metric context. So that's the third thing I'm saying is bring the tempo down. Okay? Bring that tempo down so that, and drill just that 2 beats. Isolate. Remember, I have a video about the practice formula. And we want to isolate the problem. If the rhythm, so usually when we have a rhythm problem, it's not the whole piece. It's usually like 1 or 2 beats long. So isolate that rhythm and drill it. And one of the things I learned from the salsa world is how the drilling can work. In the salsa rehearsals, in salsa they have what they call breaks. So you have the groove, right? Boom, 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 ba-doom, boom, ba-doom, boom, right? And then you have a place where the groove stops. And everyone goes bum ba dum bum bum ba dum bum, right? And that's the intricate rhythmic part of a salsa tune. And what they'll do is they'll sit in a drum circle in the rehearsal and play that same rhythm as if it was a mantra almost. Bump ba da bump bump ba dum bum two bump ba da bump ba dum bum two ba da 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 da. They'll do that over and over again, like drumline type stuff. Okay, and I do that and I do it with the students too. My students rarely have rhythms like that we have to take to that level. But when we do encounter it, that's how we do it in the lesson. We turn it into sort of a loop. And the nice thing about using that loop concept is that the loop has built into it the meter, the groove. When I did that, bump, ba-da, bump, bump, ba-da, bump, all of the right, there's clave in what I just did. They're not depart. So that's the interesting about clave, right? You can tell someone that doesn't know clave, doesn't know salsa, because they'll try to play the clave over a salsa tune. The clave is not played; it's implied. It's the groove of what we're doing. That would be like someone. That would be the equivalent in classical music of someone playing a clave, click, 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 click. Right? You don't. That's not necessary. You don't have to play the clave rhythm on the clave sticks. I mean, sometimes they do that, right? But not very often. You don't have to do that because that is the essence of the groove that they're playing. So when they play this break over and over and over again, the clave is in there even though the clave isn't explicit. It's implicit. All right? So I guess that's my last tip for you in learning rhythms. Take the rhythm that you're struggling with, take it to whatever tempo that you can do it confidently at, and turn it into a loop, because that loop is going to have built within it the meter, assuming you're doing it right. Okay? But that's what we're shooting for, is to practice the rhythms in a way that maintain the metric integrity. I'm using big words today. All right? So that's what I have for you. I know this is a lot. They talk about biting off more than you can chew. This is a lot to digest, right? If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. This is how I see rhythms. This is how I approach working on rhythms. It is not something altogether separate. It's not quarantined from the rest of the music. It's not quarantined from the musicians' culture. The rhythms are an integral part of the music and the culture that the people that the people come from. All right? And if you practice it in a way that makes it more quote unquote scientific, academic, you're missing out. You're missing it entirely. Okay? It's not just a mathematic series of ratios. If you don't have that cultural metric groove component, it's wrong. And I'm saying that as a professional trumpet player, it's wrong. Okay? Any questions you got about this, please feel free to ask. Other than that, God bless you guys. We'll see you on the next video. Thank you.